Hello, dear listener. That's right. You know who you are out there. Welcome to another podcast, another Learn Your Own Rules podcast, as it were. It is a brisk autumn day outside, which makes it the perfect kind of day to sit inside, play some board games, talk about board games, review board games, all those things. And actually, I don't know how fall went for anybody else, but for us, it went straight from summer to winter in about a week. So actually, it's freezing here. This is a board gaming podcast about board games where we talk about playing board games. I review board games, talk about board game experiences, but we don't talk about the rules here on Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast. That's right, this is a board game only podcast where we don't discuss rules in depth. As we talk about games today, I'll place some links below in the description of this video or podcast, and those links will go to other content creators that have created great videos that explain how a game is played, and you're welcome to check those out before continuing on at any point in this podcast if you'd like to know more about how a game is played while I'm discussing them. This week, I'm following our standard format. We'll talk about some games I've played recently, or more importantly, a big board game experience I've had this week, which was very exciting. And then we're going to move on to our topic of the week, which is a little different because it's the fifth week of the month this week. Normally, I like to do a review every week, a feature game. I have a little schedule set up where each week is a specific kind of game, whether it's a new game or a solo game. This is the fifth week of the month, which is a little strange. You don't normally have 5 Fridays in a single month. So today we've got a special topic, which is going to be party games/family games. We'll go through quite a few of my favorites and ones that I think work really well depending on different situations and different settings. But without further ado, let's get straight on to our discussion. First off, being my experience this week. It was an exciting week because my pledge for BattleCon Unleashed has finally arrived. It's been so long since I backed it that I'm not sure I could have grown hair on my face back then. But it's finally here. It's gorgeous. A huge box showed up. It weighed like 30 pounds by itself, and that's not including all the expansions that I still had to put in all the little tuck boxes and sort into the massive, beautiful little holder that contains all the fighters and everything. So I've spent several hours the last few days getting everything built and set up and separated and sleeved as much as I could, and I am anxious to play BattleCon as soon as I can. Unfortunately, that might be longer than I want it to be, especially because we're having a spike in COVID cases around here, and so gaming might get put on a pause. We'll see. I'm sure I'll talk more about BattleCon later. I think I'll probably do a feature review on it at some point, so expect to hear more about that, and I hope to hear from all of you out there that like to play BattleCon. This is a game that I'd love to play more. I'm hoping that now it's better organized, it'll be easier to set up and play at a moment's notice, crack out a game here and there. And overall, I have to say that the presentation is very lovely so far. I recently had a chance to play In the Year of the Dragon. This is a game designed by Stefan Feld and it is published by Ravensburger. In the Year of the Dragon is one of Stefan Feld's oddity titles. Usually he gets typecasted as a designer that just makes point salad type games. But people often don't remember that he has quite a few little oddities under his belt as well. And so I think the typecasting is a bit unfair. People don't think of games like In the Year of the Dragon or The Oracle of Delphi or even Notre Dame and Amerigo, I don't think are particularly point salad compared to many of his other titles. He's a designer that's got an impressive amount of variance in what he produces. And again, I don't think he gets enough credit for that. In terms of In the Year of the Dragon, I've got kind of a love-hate relationship with the game. It's the kind of game that there are times where I enjoy it while I'm playing, and there's times where I just really hate what I'm doing. It's a very punishing game. It's a game that is constantly demanding of you. Every decision you make feels like you're either picking the lesser of two evils or you're having to sacrifice something else to pick what you need up, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in a game. And in fact, in most cases, I think I prefer gameplay that makes your decision making so important like that. The downside in the Year of the Dragon is that there's rarely, if ever, a reprieve, so it's kind of a stressful situation. Every single round is a difficult decision, and I know I might be a minority here, but I like it when games give you more chances to take a deep breath and realize that your head is above water. Or maybe better put, I like it when a game starts off really difficult and then you get to a point where your head's above water and then you can start kind of playing with the system. For this reason, I prefer Caverna to Agricola. Agricola is a great design, but Caverna is, for one thing, more sandboxy. And more importantly, while playing Caverna, you eventually reach a point where you are treading water as opposed to just drowning. And it's at that point in the game that you can start looking around at all the buildings you have access to and figuring out cool combos that allow you to score points. Agricola, is more about barely keeping your family fed, barely making enough in resources to keep going, and it doesn't allow for that kind of free form play that I particularly enjoy. In the Year of the Dragon is along that similar vein. There's moments and turns here and there where you can start planning for the future, but normally those moments where you can kind of take half a breath and recollect yourself are happening because you've chosen to just forego a potential scoring option. For example, during the fireworks event, that's a great point in the game where you can take a deep breath and say, okay, I'm going to get some medicine or I'm going to get some food. But to make that decision, you often have to just say, I'm going to ignore fireworks for this game because I can't afford to do it. That's not to say I don't like games where you're constantly balancing difficult choices. I just don't know if this is my favorite one. And altogether, it's probably not one of my favorite Stefan Feld designs. But with all that said, this is with maybe 4 plays under my belt. So it's one of the games I'd be interested in trying more and seeing how my strategy and how I approach the game evolves as I have a chance to experience it and explore it a little bit more. Not a terrible game, not one of my favorites. In the Year of the Dragon, designed by Stefan Feld and published by Ravensburger. I also had a chance to play Legendary Encounters Buffy the Vampire Slayer. This is a game designed by Travis R. Chance and Nick Little. It is published by Upper Deck Entertainment. Now, I'm pretty familiar with the Legendary formula. We have quite a few of the Marvel Legendary expansions, not all of them because there are too many, and that would probably functionally bankrupt me if I tried to buy them all. But we have quite a few, and this is my second or third time playing a Legendary Encounters game. I played the Legendary Aliens version a couple of times, uh, at least a year ago, so it's been a while. The encounters system is interesting, and I like the idea of incorporating different IPs into the game. I like the fact that they are co op for the most part, but we'll get to that. And I think that the core system overall is just much better for a deck building game than the Cryptozoic's Cerberus system. The Cerberus system incorporates games like the DC Comics deck building game. They did a Street Fighter deck building game, which I owned for a little while, but didn't really enjoy. I think they did Attack on Titan, some other stuff. The Cerberus system is okay, but overall, I think it's a little bit shallow for what I'm looking for in a deck building game. And Legendary isn't necessarily overly robust. And thematically, it doesn't make sense a lot of the time, in that you're not really playing a character, but you have tons of different characters in your deck. Thematically, it's kind of a mess, but the system has a lot of options for combo potential that is something that I particularly enjoy. And of course, I'm a big Marvel Comics fan. I have been since I was a kid. And so I appreciate playing a game that features so many of the obscure characters that I enjoyed growing up. Going back to Legendary Aliens, it didn't really seem to shake up the Legendary format so much, which is a bit of a shame considering it's a great opportunity to do so. There were variable player powers, if I remember correctly, and that was pretty much it. But take that with a grain of salt as I only played it a couple of times. The Buffy version, on the other hand, did some pretty cool things that changed the system up quite a bit that I thought actually improved my enjoyment of the game. The Buffy version has sat on my shelf of shame for a couple of years now. I bought it for my wife, but we just never got around to pulling it out and playing it until recently. And, I have to say that as somebody with no enthusiasm, interest, or nostalgia for the Buffy universe, I was reasonably impressed with how much I enjoyed this version. And those are primarily due to those little changes that the game makes that changes up how the legendary formula works a little bit. There's two primary mechanic differences between the game. The first is this light and dark track, which is something that informs sometimes player powers, sometimes enemy powers. And there's this constant tug of war going on where cards that you play might bump that light track up, whereas enemy cards might bump that track down. And generally, your powers are more powerful the higher the light track is, and enemies are more powerful the further down that dark track is. So sometimes you're bumping it up, sometimes the enemies are bumping it down. Sometimes you've got cards that actually benefit from it being in the dark. Sometimes you have cards that will bump it down into the dark side of the track. And that was something that we had a lot of fun kind of strategizing and planning around because the scenario that we were playing really depended on where the marker was on that light and dark track. So it gave one extra little mechanic for us to strategize and discuss and try to play around as we were playing through the game. The main thing I really liked about this version, though, were the courage tokens. These are tokens that you can earn. You start with one at the beginning of the game, but you can earn them through certain card effects, through defeating certain enemies. And what you can do with these courage tokens is spend them one at a time for an extra fight power or an extra buy power each. And this was excellent. This felt amazing. One of the most frustrating elements of a legendary game is you often have to take turns where you're one off from defeating an enemy that you really need to defeat or buying a very expensive card that you really want to have for your deck. And on those turns, usually your turn is largely wasted, where you have to buy something subpar, you have to defeat an enemy that's really not that big of a threat right now, and it never feels good to have a turn that was so close to being good and then eventually just kind of was either mediocre or sometimes just completely ineffectual. The tokens really changed that up, and it's amazing how much it did considering how small of a change it is. You don't get that many tokens throughout the game, but if you are mindful of what you have available to you and what the cost is for creatures or cards you want to buy that are out on the board, you can plan around having those tokens really effectively. And you can make things happen that you couldn't normally make happen in a standard legendary game. In fact, I like that mechanic so much, I wish that there was a way to replicate it or that there was an expansion that replicated it in Legendary itself. And it's possible that maybe there is. I haven't played all the versions, all the little expansions. It's something that I think I want to look into. The art on the cards is unfortunately screenshots from the show, which is thoroughly disappointing. I hate seeing that. It's always a lazy thing to do. The card titles were obviously references to the show, which I didn't understand, so I didn't think thematically it was really all that engaging. And the game seemed to double down on that stupid semi co op environment that Legendary, for some reason, wants to push. Does anybody like semi co op? If anyone listens to this and they actually like semi co op, please message me and let me know because I want to know what happened to you. Who did that terrible thing to you? And is there anything I can do to help? Overall, though, I enjoyed Legendary, the Buffy version. It was a great experience. Particularly, the scenario we played required a lot of planning and working together as a team. It forced us to come up with methods for dealing with our particular enemies or our particular scenario at hand. And as a whole, it felt as a much tighter co op experience than even Marvel Legendary sometimes does. So that was Legendary Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It was designed by Travis R. Chant and Nick Little, and it is published by Upper Deck Entertainment. Okay, on to our topic of the week. Like I said, this is a little bit different than normal. We're having a topic of discussion rather than an actual game review, which is what I normally prefer to do because it's the fifth week of the month. And going into this special edition, I guess we could call it, I thought about the fact that we're coming up on Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's. These are times that we often spend visiting family, although that might not be the case as much this year, what with COVID being what it is. But in the event that you are visiting family, this is something that I want to talk about because I have expressed before here on the podcast that I am sick to death of going to family events and then just sitting around while my family watches football or plays on their phones. And I think to myself, why am I here? I could be doing something that I want to do, but I'm not even spending time with these people and they're just sitting around doing nothing. So, one of the most obvious ideas is, of course, bringing games to play, but that's often a bit of a double edged sword, or maybe I should just say it's often just a bad idea. If your family is anything like mine, they often talk about how they're happy to play games, but then trying to get them to actually play one is like herding sheep. Now, of course, the obvious explanation is well, maybe they don't actually want to play games, and I'm sympathetic to that. But you know what? At a certain point, I just don't care because I don't want to sit around and watch more football all day long on Thanksgiving. I want to actually do something. And I'd like to, if you want to spend time with me, then, this is a great way to do it. So I've come up with three lists of games to play with a variety of different crowds. This is realistically, each list is basically defined by the formality level of the group that you're with. So this is a scaled list that starts with the most informal group and works up to a group that is somewhat passingly familiar with designer board games. The first group are the informal players. This is a group that, you're sitting around your living room, You're just kind of shooting the breeze, chatting about whatever, and no one's really doing anything, and you can pull out a game and easily play a game in this kind of relaxed situation. In my mind, this is the apples to apples crowd, or rather, the crowd that would be most willing to just pull out apples to apples and kind of sit around and play it half heartedly while they're chatting. Please note that apples to apples is not on this list because I absolutely hate that game. There are two important elements that define this list of games. The first is that these games are pretty easily scalable. You can play with just about any number of people. And more importantly, you can have players drop in and out very easily. And those are really important elements to party games for me in general. But if somebody has to pop away to take care of a child or to put something in the oven, these are games that don't suffer from anyone having to step away to do anything like that. They can easily jump in and jump out as you're playing, and nobody is sitting around just waiting for the game to continue on. These are also games where you can carry on a conversation. You don't have to be paying super close attention to the game. You can be chatting about whatever when it's not your turn or while it's going on in the background and still have something engaging that pulls your attention and has you immersed in an experience and spending time with others rather than, watching something on your phone. I should note before going on, I'm going to do a bad thing here, and I'm not going to mention publishers or designers during this section. This is meant to be kind of a quick fire, quick discussion about each of these titles I'm going to be discussing, along with a little bit of an explanation as to why I think they are good pickups to enjoy a holiday season with your family. So the first is the Resistance. Now, the Resistance is excellent for a couple reasons. One, it's quick to teach, it's quick to play, and you can scale it really, really easily depending on your group. And you can also easily improvise the components with anything. We've played it with just a deck of playing cards before. Despite being a rather simple game, though, I have had situations where people don't really understand the meta element to the game. But even when that's the case, anytime I pull this out in a very informal setting with people who honestly have no idea what they're doing, everyone still kind of has a good time. Nobody takes it overly seriously, and the game plays so quick that by the time you've gotten just a couple rounds in, everyone's going to have a pretty good idea of what they're doing. So I definitely think this is a strong contender for that informal, just sitting around the living room. We don't want to sit down at a table and have to do anything, but we can easily play a game together. Another good option is Wits and Wagers. Excuse me, I should say this is the Wits and Wagers Party Edition. Of course, you have to do some writing, but this is an easy game to sit around and play. In my mind, it's on par with Apples to Apples in terms of complexity and in terms of teaching people how to play. It's also a game that's easy to pare down rules wise to the level of your group or to make changes on the fly and just kind of play how you want to play it. Definitely worth the look. I would consider it if you are going to be in a situation where you might want to not play Apples to Apples these coming holidays. This is a great game to pull out and say, hey, I brought this. It's not quite like Apples to Apples, but it's not any harder, and it can be a great time. Perhaps the most obvious entry on this list is Codenames. If you haven't heard of Codenames, I have to wonder what rock you've been living under. It's the quintessential party game to me in many ways. But as I said, you've probably already heard of it, and I couldn't blame you. It's about as smash hit as a board game can get. You can find it in Walmart and Target and other places like that. And so it probably doesn't necessarily need to be brought up, but I wanted to focus for a moment on the pictures and the Disney versions of this game. Codenames is a great game that appeals to really ages almost 7 and up, 6 and up, maybe 5 and up. And though I think it is a fantastic party game, it suffers sometimes from players not wanting to engage because they don't want to feel dumb. Normally, that's when you're playing as the clue giver. If you aren't comfortable doing that, then you probably shouldn't volunteer to be the clue giver. But people often don't actually understand what's going to be involved in that, and so I've seen plenty of situations where somebody sits down to be the clue giver, realizes how difficult it is, and then kind of gets stressed out over it. For that reason, I bring up the pictures and the Disney versions specifically. These are, in my opinion, probably the best versions to buy for a casual group for playing with family. More so than any of the other specialized versions. Unless your family are just big fans of one of the IPs, like there's Marvel, Harry Potter, and Simpsons, I think, are the three. All of these versions have the pictures on them. And pictures, I think, really improve the game experience quite a bit because it allows you to not just have to give clues based on an abstract term or concept. And I know some of you are probably thinking, but the words in Codenames aren't abstract. But in reality, they actually are, and you don't realize that until you start thinking about them in that way. If you're playing Codenames and the word dog comes up, well, we all know what a dog is, but my mental image of a dog is going to be very different from the mental image of a dog of somebody else. I might think of a Pomeranian, whereas Daryl might think of Scooby Doo, and Susan might be thinking of a Great Dane, right? There's a lot of variance in the concept of just the word dog, and so it's a rather abstract concept. Whereas when you're playing with pictures, you can not only base your clues off an abstract concept that links two of the pictures together, but you can also sometimes come up with clues that are much easier to identify. You could match color, you could match shape, you can match, any number of things. And so it helps improve the experience by making the role of clue giver a little bit easier on people who are playing that role. I mentioned Disney specifically because, first off, most people have seen a Disney movie or two in their lives. But that's not really what's important. The Disney version has a lot of characters from Disney movies, but those characters are things like fish or dinosaurs or elephants and things like that. Things that are easily relatable and things you can easily identify, as opposed to images from the Marvel universe. In fact, uh, I said earlier I'm a big Marvel fan. I remember looking through several of the cards for the Marvel Universe one and just barely recognizing some of them. So unless you're big Marvel buffs or big Harry Potter buffs or big Simpsons buffs, I think for the most part the pictures version or the Disney version are the safest ones to play, and those are the ones I'd probably recommend. I would hate to miss talking about just a simple push your luck dice rolling game, and my recommendations for those are Zombie Dice or Dragon Slayer. These are simple games that just include a cup and some dice. You don't necessarily need a table to play. You could have a coffee table, you could play it on the floor. It's a simple matter of just rolling dice, and you could have a little pen and paper to keep track of everybody's score. These are great games for pulling out at any time. They take, 10 seconds to teach, 5 minutes to play. You can play these with kids, you can play these with adults, you can play these with grandparents, anybody, and it's a informal, easy experience, and that's why it makes this section of the list. Now on to the slightly more formal crowd. This is for people who don't mind sitting around a table and playing a game. They probably don't want to sit down to play a game of Cavern Tavern, but they might not mind sitting down for 20, 25 minutes and playing through a trick taking game, through Pinochle. I think, is that a trick taking game? I don't even know that game. I don't think I've ever played it. But still want to have a relaxed environment where you can still kind of chat and you don't have to be paying too close of attention, but they are a little bit more involved than the informal group. The first on this list is Skull. Skull is a great game. It is a easy to teach game. Anybody that's played Liar's Dice, which surprisingly, the more I bring it up, the more I realize how common this game is. I hadn't played it for the first time until, earlier this year. So if you're familiar with Liar's Dice, this is basically Liar's Dice but with cards. It's a game that you can easily proxy if you want, but I highly recommend buying the published version because it's gorgeous. It's a game that's easy to play and have conversations with, but it's also a lot of fun. It's a great time. It can be loud and boisterous and overall a great experience. Another one is Six Nimmt or Zex Nimmt. I've talked about this on the podcast before. This is an ideal game for people who like playing maybe like trick taking games. Trick taking games have some elements of strategy to them, but every time I play one, I wonder how much strategy there actually is. This is along the same lines. I think it's as deep as a normal trick taking game is. It's just a matter of picking a card and playing your odds and capitalize on what little information you have. It benefits from being a small box. It's cheap. It's quick and easy to play, easy to teach, and strong contender for moments where maybe you even only have 10 minutes. We got 10 minutes till we're going somewhere or until something gets out of the oven. This is a great way to just spend a few minutes, play a round or two. Good pick. Moving on to Bloodbound. Bloodbound is a social deduction game that functions a little bit like Resistance, but it's got a lot more concrete information that is presented over the course of the game. This is a game that requires a table to play because you've got a number of tokens you have to keep track of, you've got your character cards you have to keep track of. This is a game that can look maybe a little intimidating the first time you pull it out, but after one round, you pretty much have a solid idea of what you're doing. And even then, the rules explanation is quick and easy, and the game plays in 5 minutes tops per round. This is one of my favorite games to play with six or more people. It is so quick and so easy to just knock rounds out, and I've always had a great time. And everybody I've taught this game to has either loved it or gone out and tried to buy their own copy right away. It seems a shame to not bring up a roll and write game. I'm not a huge fan of roll and write games. I've enjoyed the ones I've played well enough, but they're not things I'd want to invest too much money in. But I think it's worth having one or two, primarily because these are games that are also pretty quick and easy to teach. And a lot of times they are games that scale really, really well. The one I'm going to recommend today is Welcome to, primarily because it scales really, really well, and it's one of the simpler roll and write games to teach. I think my personal favorite is Ganz schön clever. The downside to Ganz schön clever is that it is a little more restricted in player count, I guess, but it's also far more complex to try to teach. There's so you pull out that scoring page and you show it to people, and I've said it before, you pull it out, their eyes glaze over because you can tell that they are not at all interested in trying to do all this math, for fun for the next 20 to 25 minutes. Welcome to is much simpler than that. You flip over cards, you pick a combo, you write them on your board, and there's not that many areas to track. And it benefits, again, I said, from scalability. You can pass out those sheets to 10 people and you can play the game. And so I think this is a better option for this group level. Sushi Go or Sushi Roll are both great options. You've probably heard of these before. These are also games you can get at most big box retailers, assuming you don't have a local game store. Realistically, I think they are both on par with each other complexity wise. I think I personally prefer Sushi Go. I like the drafting game more. And if you get the party box, you've got a lot of options for changing up your game. But the Sushi Roll version is, if anything, even easier to teach. It's easy to play. You can play this one with kids easily as well. And they're adorable. This is a game to play with grandma, especially Sushi Roll. They've got big chunky dice. They're easy to manipulate. They should be pretty easy to see. Even they're larger dice, and the game plays in 20-ish minutes. It's a good choice for the slightly more formal group that doesn't mind sitting around a table and playing a game, but still wants to chat and converse with themselves while you're playing. The last on this list are the unlock or the exit games. These are essentially escape rooms in a box. They have a series of puzzles in them that you're trying to solve a mystery or you're trying to accomplish some objective. The unlock and exit games are pretty different from each other. I personally prefer the exit games, and so that's what I would probably recommend for a more formal group, and I'll explain why. The unlock games are really great, and they also benefit from being games that are replayable. Now, naturally, you wouldn't want to replay one of these games after you finished it because you'll have solved all the puzzles, but you could gift it to somebody else, you could sell it to somebody else, and you could see some of that money back. Not a ton of money because they're like $10 or something like that. The downside to those unlock games, though, is they play with a time limit system, which can be stressful for one thing, and they also tend to have some somewhat punishing consequences for mistakes. If you guess poorly on a puzzle or, if you're having a hard time. Exit, on the other hand, is a far more relaxing and a far more forgiving experience. The downside to that is it's kind of a mini legacy game. There are components you often have to destroy to figure out puzzles and things like that. Personally, I don't have a problem with that. These games are 10 to 15 bucks a piece, and so you're basically paying 10 to 15 bucks for a couple hours of entertainment. If you want to split that up amidst a group, you're probably paying $3 to $6 per person to play. I've heard people complain about these games not scaling very well, but I think that's silly. I've played Exit with 4 or 5 people at a time, and it's been great. You read the book to everybody, you pass the puzzles around, everybody gets a chance to look at it, you discuss what you think the solutions might be. And there's going to be times where some players aren't necessarily engaged, but again, this is for that somewhat informal group where people can kind of play as they want. My mom likes when we play these games because she can be running around the house and doing things and then come look at a puzzle and kind of give her 2 cents and then step away. So if you sit down with a group of even 4 to 5, get some drinks and just kind of enjoy yourselves and take it slow, the exit games are great. I'd recommend picking up the Abandoned Cabin first. I think that was the first one actually that was ever published, but that's the first one we tried and it was great and I can highly recommend that for the slightly more informal group. But this one's kind of a bridge between this group and the next group because I suppose it's maybe a little bit more involved. The last group are the group for the brave, or better said, maybe families that already like to play games like Settlers of Catan or Ticket to Ride, games like that. And maybe you're fine playing Catan or playing Ticket to Ride. I have an aunt that is so sick of Ticket to Ride because it's what my extended family plays all the time that she refuses to show up to some events because she knows that's what they're going to do the whole time. So if you're looking for games on the caliber of Catan or Ticket to Ride that you could take and pull out and teach to a group that's dedicated to sitting down for 45 minutes to an hour to play a game, these are some good options. The first is Rise of Tribes. This was a Kickstarter from 2-ish years ago, I think. I think it's actually available at Walmart, though, if you don't have access to a local game store. It did pick up mass distribution there. Rise of Tribes is right on par with Catan, complexity wise. It's a quick game, it's easy to teach. There's some interesting variability in the upgrade tiles that come up. It's got a cool theme, and if you buy the upgrade pack, it's got some adorable little wooden meeples and little fish and little wood, or trees, I should say, things like that. It's a game that I don't think gets enough credit or enough love for what it is, and I suspect that's probably because most of the people that backed it were probably, more interested in a heavier medium weight game than they were in an entry level game. And if you look at it on the shelf at a store, it probably looks more complicated than it really is. So Rise of Tribes, check it out. If you like Catan, if you like Ticket to Ride, I think that's a great next pickup. The next is Villainous, whether Disney or Marvel. Villainous can be a little iffy, but I've taught it to my family before and they were able to pick it up right away. It's iffy because every character plays differently, and so I would exercise judgment on your group because it can be really confusing for people who haven't played a ton of designer board games to be put in a situation where they're playing a game differently than everybody else at the table and they're left wondering why. The nice thing about Villainous is you have two different kinds that appeal to different audiences. You've got the Disney Villainous and you've got the Marvel Villainous. I have only played the Disney version. I think it's a strong contender for this level of game, and I'd highly recommend it to those that have a group that can easily adapt to this level of complexity. Next up is Sagrada. Sagrada is a dice rolling game and a dice rolling game, matching colors to spaces and numbers to spaces. It's more of a puzzly game. This is a great example of a multiplayer solitaire type game, which I know a lot of people complain about, but in a family type setting, multiplayer solitaire games are often a really good option because it allows people to play a game and enjoy some time together without being overly competitive. Some families don't have a problem with that, some do. And Sagrada is a gorgeous game, and it's one that you can easily teach in just a couple minutes. You can scale its difficulty value very easily depending on how young or how inexperienced a player is, and you can play it in 30 to 45 minutes, even depending on your player count, sometimes an hour. Imhotep is my second to last game. Imhotep is a game that had a lot of buzz. It won. Did it win Spiel des Jahres? I think it won something. I can't remember. But it's not a game I've heard discussed much since then. And it's a shame because it fits very nicely into this category. It's a game that plays in 45 minutes. It's got some great strategy. It's got some really cool decision making that you have to do. And it's got some push your luck elements to it as well. And overall, this is a fantastic contender for a game like Catan or Ticket to Ride, and I'd highly recommend it to anybody who's tired of playing either one of those games. And lastly is Splendor. Splendor is a pretty well-known game, but for those of you who haven't been into designer board games long or just, haven't by circumstance haven't heard of it, Splendor is in essence, it's an engine builder game where you have essentially three actions that you can take on your turn. You pick one of them. It's got great components. It's a pretty game. Again, just like the others, quick to set up, quick to teach. And it's a game that has a really nice learning curve to it. You'll teach the game, you'll explain how it works, and then 2 or 3 turns in, and turns are quick. Your new players you'll see their eyes light up as they're playing. Oh, I know exactly what's going on now. And because it plays in 45 minutes, you can easily bust out a second game and a third game if you really want to. Again, a great introduction to players who have played some, more common designer games, but will save you having to play the same two or three over and over and over again. And again, that was a Splendor. And that pretty much wraps up my list. These are, again, games that fit a couple of different groups, a couple of different formality levels. This is, of course, not a comprehensive list. I haven't even mentioned all the games, in my collection that I could have. These are games you can pick up, most of them you can pick up pretty cheap, and you can take them with you. And if luck favors you, you can find some time to play them with your family over the holidays. And, overall, just have a good time. Well, that's going to wrap it up for me here today on Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast. I'd like to thank you for listening with me. I am freezing here in my basement, so I'm going to wrap this up now. If you'd like to get in touch with me, please email me at learnyourownrules@gmail.com, or you can tweet me at LYORules. I really would welcome any feedback that you give me. Podcasting is not as easy as it looks. I know I've said that before, but I feel like I am starting to catch a little bit of a groove, and I want to continue to improve, so any feedback you can give me would be very, very helpful. Have a great weekend. Stay inside because it's cold, and you know what we say, game on. Thank you for listening to the Learn Your Own Rules podcast. This podcast is created, produced, directed, and edited by Ryan Krim. Please send help.